After the final cannons of the Civil War fell silent in 1865, a restless energy surged through the young United States. The wounds of a divided nation had barely begun to scab over when a new rallying cry echoed from the halls of Washington to the saloons of St. Louis. Go west. The promise was irresistible. Land, freedom, gold. What followed was a tidal wave of migration, driven by settlers, ranchers, speculators, and soldiers, all believing in manifest destiny, the divine right of the American people to occupy and civilize the entire continent. But that dream clashed violently with a very real truth. The West was already home to dozens of sovereign native nations with cultures more ancient than any eastern city. The Lakota Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, among others, had lived, hunted, and worshipped on the Great Plains for centuries. The rolling hills, sacred rivers, and thundering herds of buffalo weren't just resources. They were living parts of their identity. The U.S. government had made promises before. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, granted the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills, a jagged spine of forested mountains considered the heart of the world in Lakota tradition. In return, the tribes agreed to peace and confinement on reservations, but treaties, in the eyes of Washington, were always temporary when opportunity knocked. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition into the Black Hills, officially to scout for a new fort location, unofficially to confirm rumors of gold. His scout struck pay dirt. Word spread like wildfire, and within months, thousands of prospectors and miners illegally poured into the Black Hills, backed by the silent approval of the U.S. Army. The government asked the Sioux to sell the land. They refused. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an invasion. And from the native point of view, the message was clear. The white man's hunger would never end. Treaties meant nothing. Promises were lies. The buffalo were being slaughtered by the bow. Millions. Children were starving. Culture was being erased. And yet still, Washington asked for more. The Great Plains, once a vast, open sanctuary, was now closing in, fenced by barbed wire, train tracks, and soldiers in blue coats. The powder keg was packed. All it needed was a spark. As betrayal mounted, and land was stripped away, native resistance transformed from scattered defiance into a rising storm of unity. Across the northern plains, tribes began to speak with one voice, not for conquest, but for survival. And at the center of this spiritual and military resistance stood three of the most legendary native leaders in American history. A Hunkpapa, Lakota holy man, Sitting Bull was not a traditional war chief but something more powerful, a unifier, a prophet, and the heartbeat of his nation. His visions and wisdom commanded deep respect among tribes. He had seen too many promises broken, too many children buried. For Sitting Bull, resistance was not strategy, it was sacred duty. In the summer of 1876, during a Sundance ceremony, Sitting Bull danced for days without food or water. Blood flowed from the 50 cuts in his arms. And then, a vision. Soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers from the sky. The message was clear. The white man's army would come, and they would fall. Only in his mid-30s, Crazy Horse was a phantom of the battlefield. Swift, elusive, and terrifying. A tactical genius, he never sought fame or political power. And he never allowed himself to be photographed. To his people, he was a spirit made flesh, the embodiment of defiance. He had fought at Fetterman, at Rosebud, and now he prepared for what he sensed would be the defining battle of his life. Gall, another fierce Hunkpapa warrior, brought a cold, calculated intelligence to the battlefield. He was deeply respected and deeply wounded. Just months earlier, U.S. soldiers had slaughtered his 2 wives and 3 children. Gall wasn't just fighting a political war. He was fighting for justice, for vengeance, and for a future. Across the plains, other tribes, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Oglala, responded to the call. They left the reservations and gathered near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. The village that emerged became the largest native encampment ever recorded in North America, stretching for miles, teeming with 8,000 people, Over 2,000 warriors, thousands of horses, teepee lodges, cook fires, ceremonial drums, a living nation on the move. This gathering was a miracle. These were rival tribes with old grievances, but under the threat of extinction, they stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by conquest, but by preservation. The U.S. government, enraged by the mass exodus from reservations, issued an ultimatum: return by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. But the plains were frozen, and the message didn't reach everyone. When the deadline passed, Washington declared war. 3 military columns were deployed to trap and crush the tribes from different directions. One of them was led by a vain, impulsive officer named George Armstrong Custer. What the Army thought would be a swift victory was about to become a blood-soaked legend. In the eyes of many Americans, George Armstrong Custer was the very picture of a hero, golden-haired, dashing, fearless, a knight of the American frontier. But behind that polished image was a dangerously impulsive man, driven not by strategy, but by ambition and pride. Custer was no stranger to glory. He had become the youngest general in the Union Army during the Civil War, known for leading bold cavalry charges and defying orders, often recklessly, but with spectacular success. After the war, however, peacetime obscured him. He missed the spotlight. He missed the thrill. The Indian Wars became his second act, and he was determined to make it grand. By 1876, he had a new mission: lead the 7th Cavalry as part of a 3-pronged campaign to force the Sioux and Cheyenne back to their reservations. The goal was simple: crush resistance, break their spirit, and secure the land for American expansion. But Custer didn't see it as a tactical operation. He saw it as a stage. Bold victory over the hostiles could catapult him into national fame, maybe even political office. And when scouts brought word of a large native village near the Little Bighorn River, Custer's heart leapt with opportunity. But that ambition came at a deadly price. Custer had 600 men, yet he chose to divide them into 3 groups. 1 under Major Marcus Reno, 1 under Captain Frederick Benteen. 1 he led himself. He refused reinforcements, ignored advice from his own scouts, and scoffed at warnings about the sheer size of the native encampment. He believed the native warriors would scatter in fear, as they often had in previous encounters. But this was no ordinary village, and this time, they weren't running. The sun rose on June 25, 1876, over the hills of southern Montana. Custer's scouts, including Crow and Arikara native allies, crept to the ridgeline and gasped at what lay below. A vast village, stretching over a mile long along the riverbanks. Thousands of teepees, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing, warriors sharpening weapons. It was a city of resistance, a gathering of strength, not fear. They begged Custer to wait, to regroup, to assess, to understand the enormity of what lay ahead. But Custer, convinced the native families would escape if he delayed, refused. He believed a quick, thunderous strike would cause panic and scatter the enemy. He wanted victory today. Now. He sent Reno's battalion of about 140 men to charge the southern end of the village. Custer himself took 5 companies, about 210 men, and moved north, planning to strike from the other side. Benteen was ordered to scout a distant valley, taking vital reinforcements and the reserve ammunition pack train with him. It was a catastrophic decision. As Reno's troops charged, they were immediately overwhelmed. Hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors poured out of the village. Reno panicked. He ordered a retreat into the trees and across the river. Men drowned. Others were cut down by arrows and bullets. Survivors stumbled onto a bluff and dug in, wounded and terrified. Meanwhile, Custer was riding toward something far worse. As he crested a ridge, he saw the truth. This wasn't a scattering of warriors. This was a flood. Over 2,000 native fighters, well-armed and fiercely united, began to swarm. Warriors on horseback filled the valley like waves, encircling Custer's men. There was no escape, no backup, no mercy. Custer had expected fear. Instead, he found ferocity. The Battle of the Little Bighorn had truly begun, and it was about to become one of the most devastating defeats in U.S. military history. The heat shimmered over the Montana plains as Custer's battalion rode into history and into oblivion. Custer's men, now isolated and vastly outnumbered, moved toward the northern end of the native village, expecting to strike fear into unprepared families. But what they found was not panic. It was precision, led by warriors. Like Crazy Horse, Gall, and Two Moons, native forces surged out of the village. They were not caught off guard. They were ready. Word of Reno's failed charge had spread, and warriors now moved swiftly to intercept the northern threat. Custer's command. Custer's 5 companies, around 210 men, faced a storm of coordinated resistance. Armed with repeating rifles, bows, spears, and sheer fury, the native warriors encircled them in a maneuver rarely seen in plains combat, a full pincer movement. They attacked from high ground and low, from grass and from trees. Dust, gunfire, and screams filled the air. Horses bucked and collapsed. Soldiers dismounted, panicked, and tried to form a defensive perimeter. But Custer's command was scattered across multiple ridges. No single unit had a complete view of the battlefield. Confusion reigned. Reports later gathered from native survivors described no single heroic stand, but chaotic resistance, men running, falling, crying out. Some soldiers shot their own horses to create barricades. Some tried to escape on foot. Many died without ever firing a shot. By the end of the engagement, the hill now known as Last Stand Hill was covered in bodies. Among them lay George Armstrong Custer, 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the head. His 2 younger brothers, Tom and Boston. His nephew, his brother-in-law, and nearly every man under his immediate command. In just under an hour, the entire column had been annihilated. Over 210 American soldiers were dead. Not a single survivor lived to tell the story from Custer's side. The U.S. Army, the strongest military force in the world, had just suffered its most humiliating defeat on American soil. In the long history of the American West, there had never been a native victory like this. The ground around the Little Bighorn was littered with blue-coated bodies. Soldiers who had marched confidently into battle now lay lifeless in twisted poses, mouths open, eyes wide, rifles shattered or still clutched in bloodied hands. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had done the impossible. They had defeated the undefeatable. The village echoed with mixed emotions: grief, rage, triumph, pride. They had protected their families. They had answered the insult of broken treaties with an unflinching answer. The vision of Sitting Bull had come true. Soldiers had fallen from the sky like grasshoppers. The prophecy fulfilled. But even in victory, the native leaders understood something profound. This would not be the end. It was only the beginning of a greater sorrow. The defeat of Custer sent shockwaves through the United States. News of the massacre hit the East Coast on July 4, 1876, the centennial celebration of American independence. What was meant to be a national holiday turned into a national humiliation. The federal government responded with fury. Within weeks, reinforcements flooded the plains. The U.S. Army began a relentless campaign of retribution. Villages were burned, horses were slaughtered. Tribes were hunted down through snow, starvation, and exhaustion. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse would be betrayed and killed within a year. The survivors were forced onto reservations, their freedom gone, their way of life destroyed. The Battle of Little Bighorn was a glorious moment of defiance, but it came at the terrible cost of finality. Custer's death would be mythologized, turned into songs, books, and paintings. He was branded a martyr, a misunderstood hero. But in time, the truth began to pierce the legend. Custer had made a fatal mistake, and native warriors had merely fought to defend their home. Today, at the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, 2 memorials stand, one for the fallen U.S. soldiers, and one for the native warriors who stood against annihilation. History does not forget either, but it reminds us, even the greatest victories can carry the weight of sorrow. In the months following the massacre at Little Bighorn, America was left reeling, but not from empathy for the native cause. Instead, the public turned its grief into myth and its embarrassment into hero worship. From the ruins of the battlefield, a new image was born. General George Armstrong Custer, the fallen knight of the frontier, a man betrayed by fate, a valiant hero who fought to his last breath, a martyr whose blood had baptized the expansion of the West. Newspapers exaggerated the narrative. Painters like John Mulvaney and Cassily Adams depicted Custer as a lone warrior, pistols in both hands, standing tall on a hilltop surrounded by savage hordes. Dime novelists like Ned Buntline rewrote history, portraying the native resistance as a monstrous rebellion and the U.S. military as righteous avengers. What was ignored, and intentionally erased, was the truth. Custer had disobeyed orders, split his forces recklessly, and underestimated the enemy. The native warriors were not attackers, but defenders. The U.S. had broken its treaties first. The people Custer faced weren't wild or primitive. They were united, strategic, and protecting their home. But America, desperate for symbols, chose legend over fact. Custer's widow, Elizabeth Libby Custer, became his greatest mythmaker. For decades, she toured the country, publishing books and giving lectures. She ensured that her husband would be remembered not as a flawed man, but as a hero who died for civilization. Hollywood later carried the torch. Films like They Died with Their Boots On, 1941, glorified Custer while painting Native people as voiceless aggressors. Generations of Americans grew up believing the myth, while the truth, buried beneath propaganda and politics, remained largely silenced. It would take more than a century for that silence to begin to break. Today, the Battle of Little Bighorn is no longer seen as just a tragic defeat of the U.S. cavalry. It is remembered as a powerful symbol of native resistance, a last stand for freedom, and a devastating example of how history can be twisted by the victors. In 1991, 115 years after the battle, the U.S. government officially renamed the site to the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument and added a memorial to the EO native warriors who fought and died there. There, among the graves of soldiers, stand red granite markers, simple, solemn, placed where native warriors fell. No longer invisible, no longer unremembered, the battlefield now tells both sides of the story, the hubris of Custer's ambition, the desperation of a people fighting for survival, the blood spilled not in conquest, but in defense of home, culture, and children. The legacy of the battle continues to evolve. In Native communities, it is remembered with pride, as proof that their ancestors once stood together and won. In classrooms, it sparks new conversations about treaty rights, systemic betrayal, and whose stories we choose to honor. In America's cultural memory, it stands as a turning point, not just in military history, but in moral reckoning. Because the Battle of Little Bighorn wasn't the end of the Indian Wars, but it was the moment when the illusion of justice died. And in that death, a new truth was born, that even in defeat, native resistance was never erased. That even in myth, truth finds a way to rise. And that the hills of Montana still whisper the names of warriors who would not vanish quietly.